Hi, what's up? Welcome. Late night stream. Hope you enjoyed the earlier streams tonight. A lot of fun. A lot of good conversations. Was over there listening to the Coattail stream. What do we think about Elon? Big day on Twitter yesterday. That was huge. People were like, why are you going crazy with all this Alex Jones, Elon? Because I got like 1,300 followers out of that. That's why I talked about it all day. And now I can upload all my 4th hours without having to sit and edit all this stuff out. That's why. So hopefully that will lead to, some excellent growth on Twitter. We all know how hard it is to grow in the alternative media in these different domains due to so much opposition, so much suppression, algorithms, leftists that tattle on you. I mean, it's just a never-ending bunch of nonsense. So when we see things happen that, hopefully will lead to a lot more growth in our reach, not just for me, but for all of us in the sphere of those who want to talk about real issues. And to have Alex back on Twitter, that's a huge symbolic victory. I think it's a great thing, and I think a lot of good will come out of it. And we're never going to know everybody's motives. I don't know what Elon's motives are. I hope for the best. And I'm hoping that we can grow the real voice of alternative discussion out there and reach new audiences. So again, people who don't do this for a regular job, they don't know what it's like to have that shadow banning, suppression, and all that. I mean, it just makes it such an uphill battle to grow your audience that, we leap at what we can get. You know what I mean? I thought about doing an analysis of Leave the World Behind tonight, but problem is, I owe people this part too, and I owe it because I didn't get to this Marxist discussion for a long time because I got super busy in the last month. So I'm about a month behind on this part two, and I thought, well, I do want to go live tonight, so what I want to talk about, well, why don't I just make the part two live for everybody? So what you're seeing tonight, and this is only going to be public for a little while, is, yes, honey is actually good for that. Jamie, could you bring me some honey? Maybe in this coffee here. And maybe give me another coffee with some honey in it. Thank you. Yeah, I've actually had a lot better growth on Twitter than I have anywhere else. I mean, I've gone from... since Elon took over, I've grown from 30 to almost 60,000. So I've doubled on Twitter. My growth on YouTube is about a fourth of that. So it's worked well for me. So I'm not gonna. Everybody wants to. It's just like a 2017, 18. Remember, everybody was debating Trump's motives. What are Trump's motives? And I don't care if you want to have that debate. I listened to the whole stream. What's annoying is every time I go on a podcast or I do an interview, and the first thing somebody says is, what do you think about Elon Musk? Is he for real? And I'm like, I have no access to that. I'm as skeptical as anyone else of, and should we latch on to savior figure? I know all that. I mean, I've been watching alternative media for 20 years. So yes, I know that we have to be careful of, but I also know that people can change their mind. And I also know that there are grifters and there are con men. Very aware of that. Done countless live streams about con men and grifters. Studied cults. I know how that works.
You want another coffee with honey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please. Thank you. So anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. I mean, it has a little bit to do with it because Jamie did a great live stream on where Grimes was talking about communism. But Grimes is not, Elon and Grimes aren't together anymore. So, according to Alex, the attempted removal of reproductive organs really bothered Elon for one of his kids. And it makes sense because Elon wants to have a dynasty, right? He's all about that. So I'm sure he doesn't want to have the reproductive organs removed of his offspring. That seems logical to me. And that seems like the kind of thing that might wake somebody up. But, you know, where that's going to go, who knows? Because, you know, if you listen to the whole talk, and I was there for the whole thing, I heard it all. I remember there was a point where in the discussion, it almost got into spirituality. And that would have been a really key turning point. It could have gotten really into, hey, you know, what's going on here on the global scene is actually ultimately spiritual. There's ultimately a demonic dimension to this desire to get rid of most of the human beings. So it almost got to that. And if you heard Jack Prosobiec on Alex yesterday, I think, he had a good point about that it really would have been cool if they'd gotten into that element of it. But the discussion didn't go there. They did, however, get a lot of good information out about, you know, the real plan of the global elite. And you had these leftists hop on there and be like, there's no such thing as like this. It doesn't exist amongst the high levels of people like you think. It's like people have different views or whatever. People that have no idea what they're talking about. They haven't read these books, but they know everything. And that's like the arrogance of the pseudo sophisticated leftist person. That's just that's what's so insufferable. They don't know. They've never read any of this stuff. They haven't read Brzezinski. They haven't read David Rockefeller's memoirs. They don't know any of this stuff. But then they act like they're superior and smarter than you because they don't know it. Oh, yeah, you could tell me about a conspiracy. Oh, did you read David Rockefeller? Did you read him? Oh, tell me about it. Did you read Brzezinski's books or whatever? Really? Is there a... Oh, really? Is there a... And they don't even care. But that's their attitude. And that was the attitude of basically both of the dudes that hopped on trying to talk smack, right? Why have you not addressed the Andy Hook incident? It's like he literally just addressed that like an hour earlier, right? Y'all just talking about hair. So y'all don't even want to talk about the issues. Y'all just want to talk about hair. Okay. Anyway, tonight, what we're doing is we're going to get deep. It's not going to be a lot of, I apologize. It's going to be kind of cringe. It's going to be kind of dry and rusty like a Marxist's beard. Like the funk behind the ear on a Marxist because he doesn't wash. There's no bathing going on behind his ears. It's funky back there. Tonight's stream is going to be funky like that. I'm sorry. Because we're going into dialectical materialism part 2. Thank you. What is dialectical materialism? Why did I call it a religion? Did I take the Nazarite vow? I'm surprised all the messianic evangelical types, you never see them growing out their hair taking Nazarite vows, right? They're always maybe the Messianic Jews do. I don't know, but tonight's stream is the part 2 of the in-depth Marxism talk. So it's not going to be a lot of fun stuff. I'm sorry, but we got to do it because we got to understand what dialectical materialism really is, how it's different from histmat, historical materialism, the Western Marxists versus the Soviet bloc Marxists. Hardly anybody knows this stuff. Why that's different from liberalism, because a lot of people, it is like a cult. Good point there, John MC. A lot of people think Marxists is a bunch of liberals. No, Marxism historically is anti-liberal. It's against Western classical liberalism. So this is a fundamental mistake. Now, the reason it confuses people is that many of the Western Marxists, histmat people that we'll talk about, they ended up getting more and more into the later instantiations of oppression dialectics, right? So the Frankfurt School, that's Western Marxists. And the Frankfurt School are definitely you could say, in their political ideology, more on the left, I think. Sure. But that has to do with leftism in terms of certain social issues. Not leftism in terms of politics proper, as in elected governments. No. Or as in economics, economic liberalism. No. So people get confused over this because they think that Marxism is essentially a liberal movement. No, Marxism has the ability to morph into and utilize different movements. And so it's very important to understand Marxism as in depth as we can in order to understand where we are in the world. And then we'll understand what's happening in the world. And we won't fall into the dumb kind of, neocon dialectics of thinking that you're fighting Marxism, when neoconservatism is really a form of Marxism. It's called Trotskyism. The Trotskyites became neoconservatives. On record, that's fact. And so I took many undergrad and grad classes on Marxism, critical theory, Frankfurt School, etc. So this is why I know it fairly well. The people who are obsessed with Marxism then want to come and try to debate you and prove that you don't know the nuances of all the infinite schools and divisions. I don't care about all that. I don't care about being a Marxist expert. I do know enough about it from enough of my undergrad and grad classes to know that it's completely stupid, and it's a philosophy that's very useful for duping a lot of people and for collectivizing wealth and transferring it offshore. That's its main use. So it's used by offshore power elite to revolutionize, centralize, transfer wealth offshore, and essentially create new markets is a way to understand Marxism. Now that's very mind-blowing to Marxists. They can't fathom this because they see everything in dialectics. So when you hear a lot of discussions of dialectics, that's where we're going to start tonight. We're going to go back to the Vienna Circle. We're going to go back to Hegel. And when we understand that, we're going to understand the ethos, the principle of Marxism, and then the schisms of Marxism after that. Otherwise, you're going to think of Marxism as something that it's not. And then you're going to be dumb, and then the Marxists and the people in the mainstream, they're going to laugh at you. Ha ha ha. You think Marxism is liberal, you're so stupid. Ha ha ha. So let's start with the influences on Karl Marx, right? That's the best place to start. And thank you for those super chats. I got a couple of those from the last stream. I'll read those in a minute. Remember, this is only going to be public for a little while. So I'm giving everybody a taste of what you get in the part 2 lectures. So part 2 lectures, you get a lot of very serious content. You get a lot of very in-depth historical information, philosophical information, ideological information. And so if you do want more of this, there's about almost 8 years of archives at the website at Jay's Analysis of this kind of part 2 material. And so it just so happened that this one was, I was a little behind on this issue, this episode. So I wanted to go ahead and do it public and then let everybody know what you get if you subscribe to Jay's Analysis. You get like a vast archive of part 2s just like this. And you can see that the subscribe link to the website is in the show description. And there is that link. All right. So I spent this last week getting out all of my old Marxism notes and from all of these Marxist classes. And I didn't even remember how much stuff. I had written so much stuff. I mean, I've got written out here my undergrad and grad Marxism notes. It's literally at least 100 pages of like front and back Marxism notes. I mean, we went deep on this shit, right? And I didn't just have one. I had a bunch of Marxism, and I was taught by a guy who studied under Habermas's protege, I believe is the way it works out. So I have Marxist-Stalic succession, as I always brag. No, you don't have everything about it memorized. You're in false consciousness. Whatever. Vienna Circle. This is where we're going to start. These are the Vienna Circle positivists. And this is a group of German intellectuals very influenced by empiricism. Very influenced by what we call logical positivism. This is basically like super duper extreme David Hume, except they're not really skeptics. They're basically, these are the forefathers of scientism. So why do we have so much scientism today? It's the Vienna Circle dudes. That's why. And so these are really important. They will influence. The reason I'm talking about them is not so much because they're directly necessarily influences on Marx, but the Vienna Circle positivists were the myth dispellers, and they're going to be influential on, and they were influenced by Feuerbach, right? So they're going to be influential on a lot of the people who will be influential, I think, second generation Marxists. So you'll understand this here in a moment when we get into some of these people. But Vienna Circle meetings discussed Brentano, Helmholtz, Hertz, Husserl, Russell, Whitehead, Lenin, and Frege. So they were interested in Lenin and all kinds of topics like that. Members of the Vienna Circle also picked up on elements of Wittgenstein. One element that they liked in Wittgenstein was his notion of verificationism, and this is the idea that we shouldn't really believe in anything unless it's been, quote, verified. What does it mean to verify something? Well, it just means for them a simplistic idea of empirical observation and science data. Stack up the science papers and it's, quote, verified, right? If it's not subject to verificationism, then throw it out. And so this leads to, as you can imagine, a very limited view of the world and society. And all that can be said about society is that it's a collection of individuals. So the Vienna Circle, this is sort of a pragmatic approach and really an atomistic, individualized Enlightenment idea. But they were all about opposing myth and demythologizing, so to speak. So this is, again, another phase, you could say, of kind of getting rid of metaphysics, getting rid of old superstitions. And it was all about, for them, it was about power and power dialectics, right? Citing Bacon, Enlightenment thought had been dominated by different motifs. One of those motifs was the opposition of mythology. It was about power. People have been subjected to dependence on nature, but knowing the natural world through scientific investigation, this is via Bacon, we could then control it. And for Bacon, this was kind of a form of alchemy, right? So New Atlantis. This is human liberation. And Marx was very influenced by this idea as well, because Marx thought of this as a kind of a release from... Actually, I think this is a quote from Kant. I didn't put the reference, but the Enlightenment was... It might have even been Bacon. Enlightenment is man's release from self-incurred tutelage. Does anybody remember if that's... Is that Kant or is that Bacon? That's one of the two. So this is definitely a big influence on Marx, obviously. Dispelling mythology. The Enlightenment is a force of disenchantment. It is a force of getting rid of medieval superstitions. So the Vienna Circle wanted to do away with metaphysics, the notion of a transcendental ego or a self, all pre-Socratic philosophy, pretty much, except for a couple ideas out of people like Heraclitus, right? Maybe Heraclitus, all his flux, maybe he's relevant. The idea here is that in the anthropomorphizing of the deities, in saying that, oh, there's God the Father, or there's Apollo, or there's the Archangel Michael or something. The idea here is that all of this is that you've mistaken what's out there for what you are. And this is an idea that comes from a key figure that will be one of the earliest crucial influences on Marx, and this is a guy named Feuerbach. I'm not saying Feuerbach is in the Vienna Circle. I'm saying that the Vienna Circle is who will be very influential in pushing a lot of ideas. The first Vienna Circle was 1907 to 1912. And then you get another couple of these. Basically, this is where we're getting positivism and empiricism and scientism spread to the entire world, is what I'm trying to say. So this is from 1907 all the way up until 1924. And they're going to be important for the second generation Marxists. But they go together very well with the influences on Marx, because we're going to see that Marx is kind of positioned as a middle figure there. But before we get to Marx, we have to understand that the key influence on Marx is none other than Hegel. So you can't really understand Marx without understanding Hegel. And the problem with understanding Hegel is that nobody's really sure if they're understanding Hegel. So Hegel is so crazy that, and I'm not saying everything Hegel says is wrong, but Hegel is the absolute idealist. Reality is absolute idea. Reality is absolute spirit, which for him is idea. Everything is idea. Everything is in process towards a kind of a mega point where all of history, all of reality, everything will become self-consciousness. So there's a kind of a process philosophy of the world system is God, it's pantheistic, and it's morphing into becoming self-conscious as knowing that it is God and that it is self-conscious. And that includes everything. Matter is becoming self-conscious. Matter is evolving to become the knower knowing itself, basically. So that's the Hegelian mystical philosophy. That's actually influenced by mystical Renaissance era predecessors, and that's been shown in the book Hegel and Hermeticism, where you see people like Giordano Bruno and all these other alchemical mysticist figures from the Renaissance played a role in influencing Hegel. But also a key figure that influenced Hegel is Immanuel Kant. And for those that don't know, Kant's philosophy is transcendental idealism. There's a division between the reality that is knowable, which is presented to us, which is the phenomena, and then the unknowable realm beyond sense experience, which is the noumena, the unknowable. And for Kant, it is our mind itself that does the job of ordering reality. So the external reality that is chaos and that's unknown is ordered by the mind and put into these categories. And these are the same categories, the transcendental categories of, say, what you find in Aristotle. Aristotle's categories. But for Kant, they're not metaphysical categories in the world that structure reality. They're internal mental faculties or powers or structures that order reality in the sense data coming in. Classic analogy is that it's like an ice tray. The information coming in from the external world is like the water, and the mind organizes it into the tray. So that's the Kantian view, and that's how Kant thought he could answer David Hume's skeptical challenges. There's many problems with this. We're not going to go into the problems in Kantianism tonight, but basically Kant could never get over this divide between the internal and the reality of the external, right? There's the phenomena that you know, and the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, which you can never know. Hegel said, now wait a minute, there's a problem here, because for Kant to posit a limit is already to step over the limit. So in other words, Hegel's doing a critique of Kant, and he says, hey, Kant, this doesn't make any sense. You're actually contradicting yourself, because you've stated that you can't know the Ding an sich, but yet you're telling us that there's a delineation and a limit to what can be known. Beyond that line is the Ding an sich, and that itself is actually a contradiction. Doesn't work, because you've given a limit to an area where you say you can't know. And so basically Kant is answering Hume's challenge. Hegel is answering Kant's challenge. Now, whether that might be a good criticism of Kant, but that doesn't mean Hegel's system is the answer, right? So we don't want to go too far here and say, oh yeah, Hegel solved the problem. But if you saw the meme in the last several years of people were joking that Trump will finish the work of absolute German ideal, finish the work of creating German idealism or whatever. It was a joke that I think Kant bought and different podcasts were making, and they were memeing that out, right? Well, this is what they're referring to. Not the Vienna Circle. They're referring to this stuff with Hegel. Who will be the great thinker that will come and finish the system building project of German idealism? Well, nobody, because this is a silly project, but we can still study this and learn from this. And so Hegel says, I'm going to solve the problem of the phenomena-noumena divide that you can never get over by just saying it's all ideas. So absolute idealism is Hegel's answer to the Kantian rift, or what some have called unlimited idealism. So Hegel outright rejects the phenomenal-noumenal distinction. By the way, this is all going to be necessary to understand Marx. So we're saying all this for a reason. For Hegel, mind is Geist. In German, it is spirit. And it has the role that Kant gives to the mind. Except that for Hegel, mind structures reality because mind is reality. It's not just a structuring faculty. It is reality. Mind, spirit, Geist is reality. All reality is. So this is kind of like a Berkeleyan turn, right? Because if you remember, Berkeley is a empiricist idealist, right? Which is very unique. I think he's an outlier there. It's the only person who's ever been an empiricist idealist. And so, ironically, Hegel here is answering Kant with a Berkeleyan move, but that doesn't make Hegel an empiricist. Hegel is the opposite. Once again, everything's dialectics, so everybody swings to the opposite. So Hegel swings to the opposite of Berkeley, but he's basically making the same move as Berkeley and saying that everything is idea, right? So again, to be clear, to contrast this to Berkeley says everything is ideas, but they're ideas sensed empirically, right? So when you touch the tree, when you talk to your friend, the tree, all those things, they really exist, and you really are empirically sensing them, but they really are just ideas. So it's an empiricist idealism. Hegel is not an empiricist. Hegel is an absolute idealist. So his answer is that no, it's not empirical data. It's just all ideas. Everything is an interchange of Geist or spirit or mind. And again, everybody's making these different moves to try to solve different problems raised by Enlightenment philosophers. So David Hume raises the empiricist skeptical challenge, and now we've got the Germans answering. We got Hegel's answer. We got Kant's answer. We got Hegel's answer now. For Hegel, mind is the ultimate structure of reality. But mind is not a particular. And mind is not particular to any or reduced to any individual. Mind is universal, Hegel says. And so since mind is universal, mind is in some sense a collective then, or a universal mind. So by the way, if you've noticed when I make the transcendental argument, this is actually similar to the move that Hegel's making here. Now, I am not saying that Hegel makes transcendental arguments for God. However, there is some overlap here because when I make the divine conceptualist argument for the existence of God based on the logi, etc., that's actually what Hegel's saying here. Hegel's saying that the solution to one of these dilemmas of Kant here is that ultimate reality is mind, and it's all the divine mind. Now, I don't make that move because that's pantheistic, but it is kind of similar to the move that Hegel's making here. But I'm not a pantheist, right? So again, for Hegel, Geist or mind is a collective universal mind, and our minds are particulars of this universal. This, of course, is not in Kant. But for Kant, the structural categories in the mind are also not related to one another. And Hegel correctly saw that this is a problem in Kant's argument. By the way, if you've heard me make the argument that all the transcendental categories are kind of bundled together, Hegel says the same thing. Hegel says, no, it doesn't make sense to even think of the categories as independent of one another. That's ridiculous, right? So you think that the existence of time is has no relation to causation, that's dumb, right? The categories that exist have to be related to one another. And they can't be related to one another in just particular. They must be in kind of some universal mind sense. Again, this is somewhat similar to the way that I make tag. All these categories, Hegel says, cannot be disconnected. That's irrational. They have to be generated or connected to one another through the activity of mind. And it can't just be a human mind, because human minds are limited and finite, and they operate in space and time, and they change. The categories are not in space and time. They're not limited to space and time. They are not finite. At least we can't locate them in one place over there. And they do not change, right? So Hegel's correct here in these points. Hegel says, if you want to understand my philosophy, I mean, again, I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with Marx? Trust me, you're going to see how this relates to Karl Marx. Hegel says, let me give an analogy for what I'm talking about here with universal mind. The analogy is acorn to oak tree, right? So he's going to use like the classic Aristotelian analogy of the telos of the acorn is to flourish and become the full flourishing tree. Hegel says the process of structuring is oriented to self-knowledge, right? So in other words, just like the acorn moves to the tree, he thinks that all reality is moving towards a telos and all knowledge is moving towards a telos. And for Hegel, that telos is knowledge of self. Total self-knowledge. Not just you having total self-knowledge, but all reality moving towards self-knowledge. Again, that's the omega point of all reality coming to, in his idea, some kind of super self-consciousness of God consciousness at the end of time. That absolute knowledge and absolute process is absolute spirit. Thus, Hegel's philosophy is absolute spirit. Absolute spirit gives rise at some point to absolute spirit through human beings. So we are all in the dialectical process of the absolute working itself out in history to self-consciousness. Everything. All actions, all events, all interactions, all conversations, everything. So you begin to see how Hegel's philosophy is very much a quasi-religious, mystical rationalism. And you might think, well, this is kind of similar to Plato. It is, however, you'll notice there's key departures from Plato, because we're already, again, dealing with key problems that Plato couldn't address and failed to address. Key problems that the pre-Socratics raised that were never addressed. For example, Aristotle is dealing with Plato's lack of solving the problem of identity over time. So Aristotle's causes is a way for Aristotle to help address a major deficiency in Platonism that Aristotle sees. And I think it's a fair critique. Sure, absolutely. And by the time that we get German idealism, guess what? They're dealing with the same issues and things that were raised by pre-Socratics, Plato, and Aristotle. Except we have developments now where Hegel thinks that he's obviously got a much superior advancement in philosophy for explaining change in history. So it's even way beyond Aristotle's account of change. Because Aristotle's account of change was really, again, just kind of solving Plato's problems. But there's no telos of history in Aristotle that I'm aware of. Right? I mean, in Aristotle, history doesn't come to an end. Right? There's no eschatology in Aristotle. And I think because Hegel, if I recall, he was going to be in a Lutheran seminary or something like this. He was going to study Lutheran theology before he got into philosophy, something like that. So there is a pseudo-Christian influence in Hegel. But I would liken the pseudo-Christian influence in Hegel to that of Origen, right? It's really just window dressing for his philosophy. So in origin, the Christianity is a veneer for his Neoplatonism. And in Hegel, the Christianity of Hegel is a veneer for, I guess you could call it a kind of pantheistic Platonic process philosophy, is I guess what I'd call it. So, how are we going to get to Karl Marx? Just wait. I promise you, we're going to get you your fill. You're going to be picking the breadcrumbs out of Karl Marx's beard, and the dried soup remains in his beard by the end of the stream, and you will know every breadcrumb. You will be able to tell me what Karl Marx had for lunch as you pick the food out of that beard. All right, let's see. So I promise you're going to understand why this relates to Karl Marx here in a second. Because, by the way, are you beginning to see that all philosophy, obviously all history, is a process working itself out? Oh, you see, that kind of sounds like Karl Marx, doesn't it? Yeah, exactly. The only difference is that Karl Marx is just going to throw out the idealism. Because Karl Marx is going to be, like the Vienna Circle people, a basic bitch materialist, right? And if you're a basic bitch materialist, then everything is just matter in motion, Heraclitus, working itself out to telos. Interesting. So there's still a purpose to the universe, oddly enough. Well, I guess we should say there's a purpose to humankind. There's not really a purpose to the universe, but another element that we can't miss from Hegel, this is key too, is that since absolute spirit in Hegel is working itself out through the dialectical process of history through humans, it's through everything, but also through humans and human institutions, then in a sense, human institutions are the manifestation of Geist and of the idea. Thus, some certain history is necessary to occur. History is moving towards some kind of telos for Hegel, which is the omega point, and thus history and society obey a kind of rational law. We may not know from our vantage point what that law is, but it is moving in a law-like way. And out of this philosophy, you get people following Hegel who even set up their own kind of little quasi-secret societies. More like, I guess, intellectual groups at universities and whatnot. And one of these that's the most important for our purposes is called the Young Hegelians. And the most important of the Young Hegelians right after Hegel is this guy named Feuerbach. And Feuerbach is the most important because he utilizes Hegelianism in a way to be a critical theorist. And this critical theory gets him in trouble. Hegel, for example, never got in trouble. I think he was even lauded and praised by the Prussian ruler because Hegelian philosophy is very useful to statists, right? Hegel says the state is the march of God in history. Feuerbach, however, ended up getting into some trouble over this because he was, I don't think he agreed with all of the ideas of Hegel. Hegel was so obscure and difficult in his philosophy, for example, that many people overlooked and misunderstood that Hegel was teaching pantheism. And my professor even noted at one point that there was the possibility that the Russian Orthodox government, I'm assuming he means in Russia, at one point might have nabbed or gone after, I think it means Feuerbach. So I'm guessing Feuerbach traveled around, but they didn't really understand what he was teaching, what the revolutionary ideas were, because there were young Hegelians, I guess, that met in other countries. They had circles in other countries. And if they'd understood what the young Hegelians were up to with their criticism and their critical philosophy, they would have gone after and shut down the young Hegelians. But it was such a weird, obscure philosophy that I guess nobody really took it seriously. So, as we said, Feuerbach was the foremost of the young Hegelians. And amongst the Hegelians, there was two different groups. There was the right Hegelians, and I'm guessing the young Hegelians were left Hegelians. But the right Hegelians used this philosophy to justify total statism, total autocracy. And Feuerbach says, you know, I like a lot of this stuff, but let's go after this religion stuff because it's just crazy. He says that religious practices and thought are kind of crazy. He says that theology really is just a form of systematic theorizing, but it's systematic theorizing about things that people are mistaking for actually existing things. So when you're talking about God the Father, you're just thinking about your father and you're projecting it out there as this floating head in the sky, but it's really just you or your dad, right? And so Feuerbach writes The Essence of Christianity, which he says is, again, just this sort of projection. It's an exercise in projection. So Feuerbach, again, likes Hegel, but he thinks Hegel didn't go far enough. So Hegel questioned a lot of things and brought up a lot of interesting ideas about dialectics and that really the movement of human history is humans acting in human institutions like government or like the state. But that's not going far enough. You need to question these institutions themselves because thought arises from being and not being from thought. So here's where we begin to get the flip, and this is very crucial for understanding Marxism, the flip in Hegel. So Feuerbach and Marx are going to take Hegel and turn him on his head. And you'll often hear people explaining and describing this, that, you know, Marx turned Hegel on his head. This is what they're referring to. You know, all of this stuff about absolute spirit idea working itself out, that's just matter in motion, dude. That's just atoms bumping up against other atoms, right? Producing babies, producing war, producing destruction, predator prey. That's all it is. It's just matter in motion. And one thing that we've done, Feuerbach thinks, and this is a key idea that is going to be crucial for Marx from Feuerbach, is that when you think that being causes thought, in other words, you've got it backwards, right? Let me make sure I get this right. So thought arises from being, not being from thought. That is, alienation of human nature is what exists in Hegel, Feuerbach thinks, because of idealism. So it's not ideas, it's the other way around, right? It's not everything is ideas. Humans cause ideas. So basically there's this removal of all the metaphysics and the mumbo jumbo in Hegel, turning around and saying that all the dialectical stuff is just matter. It's not ideas interacting with other ideas. And that this very idea of thinking everything is absolute spirit, thinking about God, thinking about metaphysics, that is alienating you from who you actually are and from knowing yourself. Man in religion is simply expressing his own qualities. Thus, alienation is an unconscious process. What happens is that the object becomes the other or the author, and then we think of ourselves as the creature, right? So we think of objects as causing us, when it's the other way around. Objects are for us. We are not creatures of some other object, a God, a universe, whatever. We are being to exist, to have thought, to cause thought. So when objects become dominant, this is alienation. And so they then smush that process into time and space, you see. And they think that in the human domain, anything that allows objects to have dominance over man is a form of a promoting alienation. Does that make sense? And do you see how this will set the stage for Marx? So Feuerbach's basically doing the theological demythalization project. He's saying that theology, like Hegel, it like has all this, oh, there's this absolute mind, and there's this big guy out there, and it's God out there, and there's these metaphysical principles out there, or it's the universe is out there, blah, blah, all that stuff. That is putting object over you. And it should be the other way around, right? So this is a kind of radical humanism, you could say. And this sets the stage for Marx. And so this is Feuerbach engaging in critique. So let's say 3 things here that Feuerbach is getting from Hegel that will pass into Marx. Number 1, dialectics. Number 2, alienation. Alienation from nature, from objects, from other men, from other human beings, and from the self. And then 3 is critique. The process of doing critique. Critiquing to tear down the myths, to demythologize, right? So that we can get towards true self-knowledge and getting over alienation. And these are going to be really key for understanding everything in Marx. So we see the lineage here, right? So we went from Hegel's crazy metaphysical mysticism, his dialectical pantheistic monism. By the way, if you want to support the stream, you can via super chats, giving everybody access to a taste of what you get being a full-time subscriber, a full paid subscriber to Jay's Analysis. You can subscribe at the link in the show description, or you can support via super chats, and we've got a few of those I'll read here in a minute. If you would like to subscribe to the website, it is pretty cheap. It's $4.95 a month, $60 a year. It's been the same price for like 8 years. Yes, I already talked about how Hegel got his ideas of dialectics from the ancient Greeks. Already, you literally missed what I said, everything about pre-Socratics like 10 minutes ago. So, for Feuerbach, the process of demythologizing is to get rid of myths. And this process then reaffirms subjectivity, which reaffirms supposedly the ability of man to be what man's supposed to be, and to overcome alienation. This process then for Feuerbach, if God is human nature, you see, so God is really just humans and human nature and human society, then we will really esteem human community. So you see how this is like pretty wild movements of they're just immanentized. So God isn't really a thing out there. God is a projection of you and man. And if we realize that God is just human nature and humans, then we're going to realize that the true God is the human collective, you see. The true God is the human community. And saying that basically we're gods, not only is that what Lucifer says in the garden, it's also the same move that Marx will make in Das Kapital. So that's Hegel and that's Feuerbach. And before we get to Marx proper, we want to talk a little bit about, as we said, diamat and histmat. So dialectical Marxism versus Western Marxism. This is one of the schisms, so to speak, in Marxism. So we're going to fast forward a little bit before we go back to Marx himself. So Western Marxism would refer to Western European Marxist intellectuals. This is not Marxists from the Eastern Bloc. So we're talking about Germany, France, Hungary, and their Marxists, and probably some Marxists from Greece as well. I think there's a few of those. And so key figures in the establishment of what we call Western Marxism is Karl Korsch and the figure of Jörg Lukács. Later, after those guys, you will get people that you probably have heard. You probably not heard of those guys, but you probably have heard of Jean-Paul Sartre, Antonio Gramsci, and Merleau-Ponty. right? Those are the next generation of the Western Marxists. And this is where we start to get into the period of Frankfurt School, right? So shortly after Marx's death, the theory had become integral. We get Karl Korsch and Lukács, and they thought that Marxism needed modification. They wanted actually to return to more of a Hegelian-rooted Marxism. And so sometimes the first generation of Western Marxists, post-Marx, are called Hegelian Marxists. This dimension had been lost, they argued, in the general socialist attitude and ideology. And throughout communist parties and states, there was a need, they thought, to return to these Hegelian roots. Sociology as a discipline had become very new at this time. So early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. The father of sociology, of course, is Max Weber. I've read Max Weber's book on Protestant work ethic and all that. So he's really the father of the discipline of sociology. At the same time, we're getting the new discipline of psychology is emerging as a discipline. And the Western Marxists wanted to incorporate elements of sociology and psychology into their models. So they want to say, hey, let's use some of this Weber work ethic stuff. Let's use some of Freud and Freudian psychoanalysis. And that's going to modify our take on Western Marxism. Let's see here. There's also other philosophical movements that were new at this time period. One of those is phenomenological existentialism, and that would be Sartre, right? So that would, so I'm sure Sartre was influenced in his approach to Marxism by that. At the same time as all this is, there's a different. This is contrasted to Soviet Marxism. So Western Marxism is contrasted to the Soviet Union and its social theory, usually termed a diamat. Diamat is dialectical materialism. However, the term dialectical materialism is not actually found explicitly in Karl Marx, I think. Dialectical materialism is the notion of a deterministic metaphysic. All reality is matter in motion, and consciousness is merely an effect of the material cosmos. There are then inexorable laws of history moving towards a form of utopia or a worker's paradise. Thus, this is an ideology. In fact, it is the official ideology of the Soviet Union and its satellite nations. And this is specifically what Western Marxism begins to reject. Western Marxist theory is proposed in opposition to diamat. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre, as we said, Merleau-Ponty, Antonio Gramsci, Ernst Bloch. These are the first generation Western Marxists, second generation after. That's the first generation. And then the next generation is where we get Frankfurt School critical theory. And this will be Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, Fromm, and Walter Benjamin. And then out of that, we get the most famous living Frankfurt School Marxist today, as I'm sure everybody's heard of, Jürgen Habermas. And Habermas is who Benedict XVI wrote a book with. And so basically the development of Western Marxism is from Marx to Lukács to Frankfurt School to Habermas. That is Western Marxism, contrasted to Soviet Union Marxism. And this helps, by the way, helps people understand why this also plays into the Cold War. Because a lot of these Cold War people, for example, the Trotskyites, the Leninists, they ended up falling afoul of the Stalinists. And they ended up booted and out of the Soviet Union and finding refuge